This video tutorial is applying color and effects to objects. In this tutorial, you'll discover how to add color and effects to our Silverlight video player in the form of fills, strokes, gradients, blurs, and drop shadows. So let's pick up where we left off and continue enhancing the Fabricam logo with fills, gradients, strokes, and other effects. Now let's go ahead and select that Fabricam logo layer in the Objects and Timeline panel. And let's go ahead and hide that Fabricam logo layer. And now let's find this oval nameplate in the Objects and Timeline panel. The easiest way to do that is to choose the selection tool, which is already selected, and then click on the object. And that will automatically expand the layer that contains that path. As you can see in the Objects and Timeline panel, the Fabricam logo is not in the same container that the path is in. When we added that path in the previous module, Expression Blend automatically detected the layer that it thought that path should be placed in. Since we drew it on top of our video window, it placed the path as a child of the video window. So we're not actually ready yet to move that Fabricam logo into a container with that path object, which represents the nameplate, because we'll be covering container objects in the next module of the series. So for now, just leave it where it is and choose the path object. And now that it's selected, let's go ahead and enhance this object by applying some color to it. So over in the Properties panel, make sure that under Brushes you have Fill selected. And then just choose the color that you want the background to be filled with. I'm going to choose a yellow color. Now let me zoom in on this a little bit so you can see it better. Let's go up to, say, 300%. Now this time, let's change the stroke. So simply choose the stroke option under the Brushes panel. And just to make sure that we're actually modifying the stroke, let's change the stroke thickness by clicking and dragging here. In fact, we could even just type the number in. Let's say 5. And let's go ahead and change the color of that stroke. Let's take a nice deep red color. Now notice that we can adjust the opacity of the entire object by clicking and dragging this slider here. But let's do something a little bit more interesting and add a gradient. It's very important to understand that you can add a gradient to either the stroke or the fill. So while we've got stroke selected, let's go ahead and choose the gradient brush. Now as you can see here, it immediately defaulted to a gradient stroke. And the default colors happen to be black and white. And now let's choose the fill layer and choose gradient for that as well. But this time, we'll choose a radial gradient, and we'll reverse the gradient effect by clicking on this button. And let's choose the black color of the gradient by selecting this gradient stop, and then change the black color to something like the pretty yellow color. So here you can see we have a bright white light fading into a darker yellow color. That gives a nice three-dimensional look to this nameplate. We can increase the size of the whiteness in the center here by clicking on this gradient stop and moving it to the right. To enhance the visibility of this particular white fading into yellow, let's darken that yellow color. In fact, let's move it up to a red color. Now there's another way to adjust the gradient, and that's through the gradient tool. So over in the tool palette, choose the gradient tool, which looks like an arrow pointing down and to the left. And what you'll see here is an arrow that is placed over our fill area. If you grab the head of the arrow with the mouse and click and drag on it, you can choose the size of the gradient effect. But if you click and drag the tail of the arrow, you can change the direction of the light source that appears on the gradient. You'll also notice that there are two circles on this gradient tool, one near the tail and one near the tip. These two circles represent the two gradient stops that we have defined. In fact, I can drag those circles and move them, and you'll see the gradient stops moving simultaneously. You can also double-click on the circles to change the color. For example, we can change our white color to a green color. And then you can click outside of that color palette to hide it again. We can also add new gradient stops simply by clicking on this line. It works the same way by clicking on the gradient color strip in the Properties panel. But let's go ahead and click on the gradient tool and add a new gradient point. So now we have 3 points. We just need to assign another color to it. So let's double click on that and then choose blue, for example. Now let's say that we don't want that middle point and we want to remove it. We can simply click on it and drag and pull it away. When you get far enough away, it will automatically disappear. You can do the same thing by clicking and dragging over in the Properties panel. You can also do some very interesting things here by adjusting the opacity of that particular gradient stop. For example, this yellow area of my gradient can actually become transparent. By selecting the yellow gradient stop, you can adjust the gradient's alpha, which will give it transparency. So 100% means fully opaque. But if we drag it downward, say to 50%, this particular area of the gradient is more transparent. Now it's not that obvious unless you have an object behind it. So let's go ahead and temporarily put an object behind it so that you can see the effect. Let's grab this text tool and we'll add a text block. In fact, I'll just keep the default text there. Then choose the selection tool and move it right about here on top of the nameplate. But what I really want it to do is appear behind the nameplate. So since I know the nameplate is represented by this path object, in fact, while I'm at it, I'm going to rename it. Just to make sure I rename the correct one, I'm going to hide and then display it again. Sure enough, it is. Now I'm going to drag the text block and move it above the nameplate. That actually puts it behind the nameplate, which is kind of the reverse way that it works in other software packages like Photoshop. The way Expression Blend works by default is that the objects are drawn from the top down. However, you can change the order by clicking this button down here. So getting back to our text block, you can see that this particular part of the gradient is transparent, but as I move it to this part of the gradient, it becomes less transparent. So let's go ahead and delete that text block. And now let's reselect our nameplate and choose the stroke, and let's bring that back all the way down to 0. And now let's take our Fabricam logo and unhide it. Now there are a few other effects we can apply to this nameplate, and you can access those effects through the Appearance panel. So in the Appearance panel, you'll see something called Effect, and then a button called New. Let's go ahead and click the New button, and you'll see that there are two different effects available to us. There's a blur effect and a drop shadow effect. Let's add the blur effect. So now you can see the edge of this nameplate has been blurred. We can actually increase the blurriness by choosing a larger radius. And we can decrease it by choosing a smaller radius. Let's choose a radius of about 30. We can also add a drop shadow effect, but let's do that to the actual Fabricam logo. So go ahead and choose the Fabricam logo in the Objects and Timeline panel. And then also under the Appearance panel, let's choose a new effect, and this time let's choose Drop Shadow. So you can already see that the drop shadow has been added behind our logo, but it's a little bit too blurry and a little bit too distant. So we can adjust the distance or the shadow depth right here. Let's set it to a depth of about 3. And we can also adjust the blurriness of that shadow by adjusting the blur radius. Let's set that to about 3 as well. Furthermore, we can adjust the opacity of that shadow. Let's set that to about 65%. And we can also adjust the color of that shadow. Let's give it sort of a very, very dark green color. And finally, we can adjust the direction of light that casts the shadow. So let's set it to about 320 degrees. And now let's zoom back out to 100% and recenter our video player. And let's go ahead and press the F9 key to hide our handle. And there you have a very interesting nameplate for our Fabricam logo. That concludes this tutorial. In this tutorial, you've seen how to add color and effects to our video player in the form of fills, strokes, gradients, blurs, and drop shadows. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.